Although a central function of film and other art forms is to entertain and provide the audience with a break from reality, they can simultaneously present unique opportunities to reflect on far more solemn subjects. The widely acclaimed 1992 revisionist western Unforgiven heavily embodies this principle. Masterful acting, writing, and cinematography combine to present difficult questions of morality and ideology, couched in the familiar setting of the rough-and-tumble American frontier. From these questions has emerged what can be referred to as the common perspective of Unforgiven's plot, the perspective that is generally encountered in most discussions and reviews of the film. In this video, I will detail a comprehensive view to the contrary that I believe to be a more objective and better supported analysis of the storyline, along with contextualizing the film's events in the surrounding history of the American frontier. And just in case you were wondering,
oh yes, there will be
spoilers. Released in 1992, Unforgiven is a prime example of a revisionist western, sometimes termed as anti-western, a subset of the western genre that aims to deconstruct the mythos of the American frontier, often presenting traditionally heroic cowboys and gunslingers in a far more morally ambiguous, if not outright sinister, light, questioning not only the audience's expectations of who is good and who is bad, but the very meaning of these terms. Though one of the pivotal entries in the subgenre, Unforgiven was by no means the first or last. Previous prominent revisionist westerns include The Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and the outlaw Josie Wales, from the 1960s and 70s, with Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight being more recent instances. Unforgiven tracks protagonist William "Will" Munny, portrayed by Clint Eastwood, an infamous outlaw who has since retired from a life of wanton murder, robbery, and general criminality, settling as an aging widower and pig farmer with his two young children. After the introductory crawl describing Munny as a known thief and murderer of a vicious and intemperate disposition, Unforgiven opens to the fictional frontier town of Big Whiskey, Wyoming. In the year 1880, two cowboys are visiting the town brothel, and one of them enters into an altercation with one of the prostitutes after she giggles at his small penis. Enraged over the apparent affront to his manhood, the cowboy, named Quick Mike, savagely attacks her, cutting her several times across the face.
Paris, you think it's funny?
Get away!
Sheriff Bill Daggett, the central antagonist of the film, referred familiarly as Little Bill, punishes the two cowboys involved in the attack by fining them. This decision proves critical to the plotline. Strawberry Alice, one of the brothel prostitutes who serves as matron to the others, is outraged by the mildness of Little Bill's punishment and organizes the remaining girls in the brothel to pool their savings and put out a $1,000 bounty on the lives of the two cowboys, equivalent to approximately $26,000 in 2021. Shortly afterwards, in nearby Kansas, William Munny is contacted by a prideful and brash young man going by the name of the Schofield Kid, whose uncle was part of Munny's old outlaw crew. The Schofield Kid is caught wind of the $1,000 bounty and asks Munny to help him acquire it, or in other words, asks Munny to go on an assassination mission. Although initially declining the kid's request, Munny reconsiders after assessing his struggling pig farm and need to provide for his children. He recruits his old outlaw partner, Ned Logan, and together with the kid, the three ride off to claim the $1,000 bounty. The remainder of the film builds up to the climactic confrontation between Munny and Little Bill, brilliantly composing a condensed character study for both protagonist and antagonist along the way. Little Bill's severe, uncompromising, and extrajudicial beating of English Bob, an old adversary of his who delights in lording English supremacy over his American hosts, demonstrates Little Bill's hatred and animosity for what he terms men of low character. Men like English Bob who pretend to be of substance, but are really nothing more than degraded charlatans hiding a rotten and vulgar nature. During the same time, Money is shown in a state of almost constant regret and penitence over his past wickedness and murderous villainy, rejecting numerous offers of whiskey from Ned in fear that it would quickly undo his decade of sobriety and bring to surface his inner demons. These repeated contrasts inexorably urged the audience to closely sympathize with Money, on top of the natural sympathy that is often already tendered towards the protagonist, largely eclipsing or outright supplanting Money's murderous and rapacious past, as well as the very fact that he is a mercenary on an assassination mission. The ensuing contrast between antagonist and protagonist leads directly into their first confrontation at the brothel tavern in Big Whiskey. A sickly and weary Money repeatedly lies to Little Bill about being armed, prompting Little Bill to confiscate Money's concealed firearm, beat him, and run him out of town, similarly to Little Bill's treatment of English Bob earlier.
You are a bunch of bloody savages!
This is the background that brings the audience to the two most decisive scenes of the film: Little Bill's torturous whipping of Ned, and Money's furious retaliation against Little Bill and the rest of the Big Whiskey police force. As we explore the surrounding history of the American frontier and the film's plot in greater detail, it will become apparent that the common perspective of Unforgiven either misses or largely ignores the thematic conditioning of the storyline, falling victim to the casual and ever-present urge of commiserating with the protagonist at the expense of objectivity. The common perspective presents Little Bill, the film's antagonist, as a cold-blooded psychopath who rules the town of Big Whiskey with an iron fist, profoundly abusing his power and inflicting sadistic torture on anyone who dares cross him. Money, despite his shortcomings and villainous past, is openly or implicitly championed as a sort of dark hero who brings Little Bill his just desserts, an avenging angel of death who borders on the archetype of chaotic good, violently imposing his will against a corrupt and greater evil. As much as this brusque interpretation triggers feel-good and satisfying sensations within the viewer, allowing for a comfortable compartmentalization of the characters and their morality, it is poorly supported, if at all, by the film's scenes, and further weakened by the history in which those scenes develop. Unforgiven's fictional frontier town of Big Whiskey during 1880 is not set in the state of Wyoming, but the territory of Wyoming. Wyoming did not become a state until 10 years later, in 1890. The American frontier itself is generally defined as the geography and culture westward of the settlement line that European colonists first established in the 17th century. Although it can be argued that the frontier technically lasted until the admission of Alaska and Hawaii in 1959, this belies the idea and substance of the frontier as sparsely populated areas of budding and developing communities that had yet to fully integrate economic, legal, and governmental infrastructure. This animation from the United States Census Bureau shows the progression of population density westward from 1790 to 1890, with the Bureau defining the frontier as westward territory that had a population density of less than 2 people per square mile. According to the 1880 census, Wyoming was tied with Montana for having the lowest population density out of any United States territory or state, at only 0.2 people per square mile. Although dramatized accounts of the American West in literature and film have contributed greatly to crafting and embellishing the legends of frontier life, the reputation was not entirely undeserved. Emerging communities in thinly populated areas were fertile ground for marauding outlaws and rambunctious delinquents, at times confounding law enforcement officers and marshals who had limited resources and personnel to pursue the wrongdoers. Despite the terms Old West and Wild West conjuring up perhaps a century or more of American history in the popular consciousness, historians generally quarantine these times to the period between the end of the Civil War and 1895. These 30 years of government-promoted westward expansion coincided with mass dislocation, an immense influx of available firearms, and waves of disillusioned, intemperate young men, many of whom had normalized violent and cutthroat lifestyles following the end of the Civil War. Contemporary accounts describe various rough and rugged frontier towns in and near Wyoming. Reporter Leander Richardson wrote of Deadwood, South Dakota in 1877, "I never in my life saw so many hardened and brutal-looking men together, calling it a disorderly, sinful, sickly city, a queer place." In nearby Miles City, Montana, 4 years later in 1881, visiting District Judge D.S. Wade observed that it was a lively little town of 1,000 inhabitants, but utterly demoralized and lawless. It is not safe to be out on the street at night. It has 42 saloons, and there are on average about half-dozen fights every night. Almost every morning, drunken men can be seen lying loose about the city. As grim as these accounts may be, they were not necessarily representative of the West as a whole, which in many, if not most, locales was closer to being mild rather than wild. As the character of Beauchamp in the film is meant to warn, exaggerations by writers, including, on occasion, newspapers and those providing first-hand reports, helped sell the West as an unbroken jungle of bedlam and vice. Nevertheless, rapid population growth and the inability of legal infrastructure to keep up did give rise to hotbeds of brazen disorder in the post-war West. Cities like Cheyenne, Wyoming, Leadville, Colorado, Tombstone, Arizona, Abilene, Kansas, and others. Violent exchanges and livestock theft in some of these unruly trouble spots prompted the emergence of vigilante groups and so-called miners' courts. Although these were indeed partly the result of ineffective, slow, or non-existent formal legal channels, many were also the product of a populace that had not yet fully incorporated or internalized the courts as the exclusive source of justice. These ad hoc organizations satisfied public outrage, or at least claimed to, by delivering so-called frontier justice, extrajudicial punishment that usually took the form of whippings, hangings, or other types of lynching, depending on the severity of the crime. By the end of the Civil War, California reported 30 or so vigilante groups, with others in Colorado, Nevada, Washington, and Montana, including the colorfully named Stewart's Stranglers, a group formed in 1884 Montana that shot or hanged at least 30 cattle thieves. In the late 1860s, disorder and lawlessness ran so high in the Wyoming cities of Cheyenne and Laramie that vigilante groups with hundreds of members were formed, resulting in several raids and hangings against the town's most infamous desperados. Punishment through formal legal channels predominantly centered on fines and incarceration in state or federal penitentiaries. Hangings were generally reserved for the worst offenders, particularly premeditated murder or train robbery, and often attracted hundreds, even thousands of spectators who took the occasion as a sort of festive, if not morbid, entertainment. States gradually banned public viewings of executions altogether to prevent the unseemly rowdiness that such displays commonly provoked. Additionally, unlike its close neighbors to the north, south, and west, Wyoming did not experience as significant of a mining boom or gold rush, keeping its population numbers depressed relative to the surrounding states and territories. Outlaw gangs, including Jesse James and Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, took advantage of this expansive and open wilderness, using a location known as Hole in the Wall for a strategic hideout from law enforcement. This is part of the history that encircles Unforgiven's small town of Big Whiskey in 1880, a year falling squarely in the middle of the American Old West time period. Objective analysis of the plot and characters must consider this context, given that it serves as an important backdrop for character motivation and meaning, particularly some of the actions and statements made by the antagonist, Little Bill. Ironically, in light of how well Unforgiven subverts genre motifs, it is the trouble spots of the West that are most pronounced in the film's lore, commencing with the textual prologue. This point Unforgiven shares with essentially every other Western in the genre, and it is beside this setting that the story is most fairly examined. Beginning with the film's first scene, after the opening crawl, what is generally glossed over or wholly omitted from the common perspective are the vastly different levels of culpability between the two cowboys involved in the attack on the prostitute Delilah Fitzgerald. When Quick Mike first calls for his partner Davey to come to his aid, Davey has no idea what is happening aside from his partner sounding distressed and irate, and yelling out angry threats, though it is uncertain how much Davey even heard or understood of this, given that he was dashing down the hallway while Quick Mike continued to yell. What happens next is absolutely critical. Upon Davey's arrival, Quick Mike instantly demands that he hold the bitch, all while Delilah is throwing water and various furnishings across the room. Mike then threatens to cut her tits off if Davey does not hold her down. Still unaware of what provoked the conflict and what the situation is, Davey quickly complies with Mike's fuming demand, only to immediately release his hold and protest in horror when he sees what Mike is doing to Delilah. Not only does Davey scream, "Jesus, no, Mike," in shocked protest, pleading with his partner to stop the savage attack, but he twice attempts to pull Mike away, being thrown aside each time due to his partner's significantly larger stature. The upshot here is two disparate levels of culpability. In modern legal terms, Quick Mike is clearly guilty, at the least, of aggravated assault and battery, on account of using a deadly weapon, a knife, as well as causing serious bodily injury to Delilah's face. Punishment for aggravated assault and battery in Wyoming today is a felony that carries a penalty of up to 10 years imprisonment. The first instance of such a statute in Wyoming appears to be from 1884, a few years after the events in Unforgiven, defined as unlawfully and maliciously inflicting grievous bodily harm, including cutting, stabbing, or wounding, with a penalty of a $2,000 maximum fine or up to 1 year in jail, or both, depending on the court. There also existed a crime called mayhem, which many states still retain today. Chapter 35, Title 3, Section 26 of the Wyoming statutes defined mayhem as unlawfully depriving a human being of a member of his or her body, or disfiguring or rendering it useless. If any person shall unlawfully cut out or disable the tongue, put out an eye, slit the nose, ear, or lip, or disable any limb or member of another, such person shall be guilty of mayhem. At the time of Unforgiven's events, punishment for mayhem ranged between 1 and 3 years incarceration, though shortly after, in 1882, the Wyoming legislature extended it to 1 and 20 years in prison. Since aggravated assault and battery did not yet exist in 1880, the most likely charge against Quick Mike would have been either mayhem or some other variation of assault and battery with intent to cause serious bodily harm. Assuming he was tried and convicted before a fair and impartial jury, a task of considerably greater difficulty on the American frontier than in the present, his punishment would likely have ranged up to several years of incarceration, and possibly a fine, but certainly not a hanging or execution. Even if Quick Mike had committed his crime under the heavier 1882 mayhem statute, it is unlikely that his sentence would have approached the 20-year maximum, assuming he was charged with that statute to begin with. We can see later in the film that Delilah's wounds consist of several prominent scars on her face, and although there is no question that she has been a victim of a serious crime, she has not been maimed or disabled in the sense of having lost functionality of her senses, organs, or limbs. Relative to the severity of the injuries contemplated by the mayhem statute, Quick Mike's punishment would probably fall within the lower range set by the legislature. This is not to minimize the attack or Delilah's resulting injuries, but rather to contextualize such injuries within the scope of harms specified by the laws at the time. In any case, no matter what the operative language for Quick Mike's punishment or his ultimate sentence would have been in Wyoming territory in 1880, in no way would it have included the possibility of an execution. On the other hand, it is doubtful whether the second cowboy, Davey, is guilty of any crime at all. Recall that Davey's entry into the room coincided with Delilah throwing various furnishings at Quick Mike, with Mike demanding that Davey hold her down or else he would cut her tits off. Unsurprisingly, prostitutes in the Old West generally occupied positions of public disrepute, as related by the common and mildly euphemistic term house of ill repute, used to refer to brothels or whorehouses. Contemporary jargon included getting touched or rolled by one of the working women in such establishments, meaning that the client had had some or all of their valuables stolen. This is corroborated later on by Strawberry Alice telling Little Bill she didn't steal nothing. Regardless of whether this is what Davy thought to be the source of the conflict between Quick Mike and Delilah upon first entering the room, his actions and statements make it clear that he had no intent to assist Quick Mike in his attack. The moment that Quick Mike starts cutting Delilah, Davy exclaims in horror, "Jesus, no, Mike," and immediately releases her, twice attempting thereafter to pull his partner away, albeit unsuccessfully. Little Bill, the sheriff of Big Whiskey, is introduced next, his first words being, "They wouldn't let you settle it, huh?" This refers to Skinny, the brothel owner and operator, demanding Little Bill's intervention in the incident. After first checking on the extent of Delilah's injuries and establishing that they are not life-threatening, Little Bill intends to punish the two cowboys by whipping them, otherwise known as flogging or flagellation. The process of beating the body with various instruments, very often a whip, administered repeatedly to the back or front of the bare torso. Criminal statutes and vernacular from the 1800s often described whipping in terms of lashes, with each whip or strike against the body counting as one lash, the total number being determined in proportion to the gravity or nature of the crime. Flagellation and other forms of judicial corporal punishment have been present from antiquity into the modern era, and are still part of the official penal codes of several nations in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. In most other parts of the world, including the West, the practice is presently prohibited and largely considered cruel, inhumane, and torturous. However, despite its gradual elimination over time, this was not the uniform or even the prevailing sentiment in the 1800s, especially in the Old West frontier. Although United States federal law banned whipping as a punishment in 1839, the practice remained in a number of states, both in the East and West, along with continued use in the military and prisons. For example, in 1882, Maryland enacted a statute authorizing whipping of up to 40 lashes for the crime of wife beating, to be administered by the town sheriff. California, in 1851, amended a statute for petite larceny to include the possibility of punishment by 50 lashes against the bare back, and in 1876 enacted a statute similar to that of Maryland, allowing punishment for wife beating by a minimum of 21 lashes on the bare back, again to be administered by the sheriff. And as late as 1972, Delaware's penal code still permitted whipping as a punishment, though it had not actually been carried out in the state since the 1950s. Despite his initial intent to whip the two cowboys, Little Bill chooses to fine them instead, after Skinny, the brothel owner, protests. Skinny's central concern, if not his only concern, is the potential lost revenue to the brothel on account of Delilah's injuries. Less people are likely to pay for her sexual companionship now that she carries prominent scars on her face. He produces what he calls a lawful contract between himself and Delilah, demonstrating an investment of capital, and refers to Delilah as damaged property, which follows Little Bill's own reference to Delilah as property. Both Skinny and Little Bill are undoubtedly aware that after the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude in 1865, no human being in the United States can lawfully be considered property. Therefore, their description of Delilah in this manner is an informal and crude reference to her status as a contract prostitute under Skinny's authority and care. Regardless of Delilah's profession or contract, she is still entitled to the full protection of the law, and her attacker, Quick Mike, is subject to arrest, charge, and trial. But instead of arrest and charge, Little Bill fines both Quick Mike and Davy 5 horses and 2 horses, respectively, to be delivered to Skinny as compensation for Delilah's injuries.
Guess you just soon not have a trial, no fuss, huh?
No, sir.
All right. You did the cutting. Come to the thaw, you bring in 5 ponies and you give them over to Skinny here. 5. And you bring in 2. You give them over, you hear?
Yes, sir.
This action is unquestionably a malfeasant and illegal failing of his duty as sheriff, both on account of electing not to arrest and charge Quick Mike, and for administering extrajudicial judgment himself, something that is beyond the purview of the sheriff to do. His tone and words to Strawberry Alice, who protests vehemently against the lightness of the penalty, are of special import.
Hell, Alice. I mean, like they was tramps or loafers or bad men. You know, they were just hard-working boys that was foolish. If they was given over to wickedness in a regular way, I'd understand.
Of course.
Alice?
Enter Delilah.
This differentiation between hardworking foolish boys and those who are given over to wickedness in a regular way is a glimpse into Little Bill's ideological motivation, something he demonstrates in spades later during his confrontations with English Bob, Ned, and Money. The ideology can roughly be described as a sort of hyper-pragmatic de facto authoritarianism, a wholesale imposition of sanctions from a single entity with the express purpose of quickly and efficiently resolving conflict and restoring peace and order. Little Bill's idea is that Quick Mike is unlikely to present a continuing threat to the community. He is not an outlaw or someone predisposed to routine criminality, but rather a working cowboy whose drunken loss of temper and inferiority complex over his small penis resulted in a terrible attack. This rationalization, of course, does not remotely justify Little Bill's decision, and it is evident that his remarks to Strawberry Alice are part pretext for his consideration of prostitutes as second, even third-class citizens, a sentiment nearly omnipresent in the Old West. Amidst a backdrop where life and limb were periodically exposed to elevated peril, the pressure for expedient, albeit deficient, justice unfortunately sharpened, something also reflected not only in the rise of vigilante groups, but the sporadic and capricious nature of many court trials. Those who suffered the most from this inequity were often persons whom systemic and societal prejudice had already relegated to the lower social strata. Little Bill's first words, "They wouldn't let you settle it," are consistent with this history. Notwithstanding this context, the punishment of a 5-horse fine for Quick Mike, the cowboy who cut Delilah, is plainly no justice at all, while the 2-horse fine for Davy is too heavy, given Davy's lack of intent to do Delilah harm and his attempt to stop Quick Mike from injuring her. The perspective I am presenting here holds Little Bill's failure to properly punish Quick Mike as the worst thing he does in the entire film. This is in stark contrast with the common perspective that typically holds the whipping and beating of Ned as by far Little Bill's worst act, something I will examine in detail further on. It can conversely be argued that the prostitutes themselves, like Little Bill, also embraced expediency and efficiency in their pursuit of justice, after being failed by the sheriff. That is certainly true, but the purpose of this video essay is not to demonstrate that Little Bill is without blame, but rather that he and the other figures in the story have been judged improperly. The prostitutes and their agents used one injustice as a vector for a much more vicious one, and it is this that the common perspective either marginalizes or completely misses. Following these opening scenes in Big Whiskey, an aging William Money is introduced 2 states away, in Kansas, clumsily tending to his pig farm. His 2 children are assisting him as best they can while he struggles to corral the animals into their proper enclosures. These mundane domestic tasks, along with Money's age and struggle to perform them, form a foundation for audience relatability and affinity to the protagonist, a foundation that is quickly reinforced and substantiated by Money's reflective disavowal of his former wickedness and outlaw criminality. As the film progresses, Money continues to repeatedly repudiate his past lifestyle in his conversations with Ned, declaring that his deceased wife cured him of his vice and malevolence, leaving him a changed man.
My wife, she cured me of that. Cured me of drink and wickedness.
Despite these persistent and sincere assertions of moral transformation, Money's subsequent actions reveal them to be largely a self-serving fiction. The bulk, if not all, of the real change that he has found is weariness and weakness brought about by old age, and it is simply the combination of aging, care for his children, and abstinence from alcohol that has given his true character far less opportunities to show itself. We see this initially when the trio assassinate the first cowboy, Davy. Ned turns profoundly morose and near catatonic after the first shot, unable to fire another, while the kid seems to be almost in a state of mania, feverishly quizzing whether Davy has been killed or not. In plain contrast to this, Money remains perfectly stoic after delivering the final shot, casually flicking pebbles against the rock formation while his victim bleeds to death below. Despite the homicidal viciousness of this scene, the audience's affinity towards Money is not only permitted to continue, but is encouraged, firstly through the kid's indignant declaration of not cutting up no woman,
I think you shouldn't have cut up no woman, you asshole!
and secondly, only moments later, by Money's seemingly benevolent grant of water to the dying Davy.
Give me a drink of water, would you, Slim? Will you give him a drink of water, for Christ's sake? We ain't gonna shoot.
These elements serve as a sort of safe harbor for the unsuspecting viewer's conflicted consciousness, easing moral unrest and perpetuating commiseration for the assassins. The audience is hastily reminded of Davy's involvement in the attack on Delilah at the beginning of the film, facilitating quick installation of his murder as a kind of righteous vengeance. Money's concession of water to Davy to ease his agonizing final moments is consequently strongly perceived as a mark of compassion that all but overshadows the murderous act itself. How generous of the mercenary assassin to allow his victim a moment's reprieve before succumbing to impending death. Contrary to the kid's cursory accusation against Davy for cutting Delilah, it should be remembered that Davy is the one who repeatedly tried to stop his partner from harming Delilah. And even if he had aided in the attack, which he had no intent whatsoever to do, killing him or his partner is an irreversibly extreme and unjustified penalty. One injustice cannot be used to justify another, particularly a much larger one, a primary theme throughout the film that we will see frequently. Legally and ethically, Davy is without fault for Delilah's injuries, but Money and his crew have no concern for that or the divergent levels of culpability, nor do they suffer under any misguided illusion of avenging or redeeming the honor of Delilah the prostitute. They are mercenaries who are after one thing and one thing only: money.
I just need the money. Get a new start for them youngsters.
Even this materialistic motivation is immediately pacified by Money's follow-up of "get a new start for them youngsters." His paternalistic aspirations become yet another avenue for audience rapport that distracts from the pernicious substance of his mission. By the time Delilah's injuries reach Money, the story has been transmuted from several cuts across her face to a grotesque and horrific mutilation.
They cut up her face. Cut her eyes out, cut her ears off. Hell, they even cut her teeth.
Jesus.
When they see Delilah in person and realize that her injuries have been so grossly exaggerated, there is no pause or reconsideration in the slightest of their intent to murder the two cowboys and collect on the bounty. Thus, although Money's regret over the error of his ways during his youth is in itself a meritorious first step towards an ethical character, it is mostly reduced to a veneer of lip service and guilt management when contrasted with what he does in the film. His unchanged core character is further evinced by the striking difference in temperament brought on by his consumption of alcohol. For the majority of the film, Money again and again refuses Ned's offers of drink, dreading that even a minor break in his sobriety will unleash the depravity and viciousness of his past. Despite his assiduous self-restraint, even through sickness, his inner persona awakens with a fatalistic roar for the film's climactic resolution. Upon hearing of Ned's death at the hands of Little Bill, he grabs the whiskey bottle from the kid and takes his first drink in years. Only a few moments later, his congenial and apologetic demeanor is supplanted by a steely, venomous, and fierce presence, commanding the kid to surrender his Schofield pistol with a cutting imperative. At this point, Money is no longer the same person he was earlier in the film. His repressed ruthlessness and virulence have regained their ascendancy as if they had never waned at all, dead set on delivering a retributive tempest upon Little Bill and the rest of the Big Whiskey police force. It is no simple coincidence that the setting of Money's bestial awakening takes place in a town named Big Whiskey, or that his final entry into the community is symbolically preceded by the heave of the now empty whiskey bottle. The villainous depths of the protagonist and the assassination mission of his mercenary crew are further muted and softened through carefully interspersed juxtaposition. Little Bill's corporal punishments and Money's incessant contrition over his past misdeeds are sandwiched together, producing a marked contrast that reaches a fever pitch just prior to the climax.
You don't realize I ain't like that no more. Claudia, she straightened me up, cleared me of drinking whiskey and all.
Money's sincerity in these sentiments comes through genuinely, engendering further commiseration from the audience not only for the protagonist, but by extension to his crew, Ned and the Kid, who are presented as likable characters in their own right, notwithstanding their participation in a mercenary assassination plot. The Kid, impetuous and impulsive, boasts of his prowess with a gun, of how he is more of a killer than Money, serving to symbolize the romanticized vision of the Wild West, the guns a-blazing motif that characterizes the typical legends of the American frontier. Ned is presented as the consummate partner and friend, trustworthy, even-tempered, and comforting Money during his sickness. All the while, Little Bill fills the naturally less relatable, less welcoming role of the hard-nosed authoritarian sheriff who is decidedly against the protagonists. He pummels English Bob, he pummels Money, and he whips Ned to death, albeit not intending to kill him. This poignant opposition between the big bad sheriff and the contrite sinner leads directly into the hands of the common perspective. By the time of the final clash with Little Bill, Money has become the audience's dark avenging angel, an inexorable force of nature on mission to take brutal vengeance for his partner's death by destroying a corrupt psychopath and redeeming himself. The gradual buildup of sympathy and affinity for the protagonist throughout the film crystallizes in these final moments into a brilliant Trojan horse of moral seduction, a self-admitted murderer of women and children, a mercenary assassin who, despite numerous declarations to the contrary, retains a cutthroat and malignant core, emerges as the unwitting viewer's dark champion. To be clear, inclination or even ardent cheer for flawed or villainous characters is not the worry here, but rather indulging the entertainment value of suspended disbelief to the point where it begins to negotiate not just the synoptic view of the film, but abstract morality itself. Why does Little Bill beat English Bob? Simply put, to punish him for entering his town with murderous intent, and, more importantly, to send a resounding message to any other would-be assassins who are contemplating travel to Big Whiskey for the bounty. Despite his polished outward appearance and lofty elocution, English Bob's history and pretentious sensibilities reveal him to be of a contemptible and repugnant character, a low-life pretender whose tales of honor and glory collapse into hot-air braggadocio. Little Bill first learns of the prize put on Quick Mike's and Davy's lives from Skinny, the brothel owner.
They're paying $1,000 to whatever son of a bitch kills the two boys that cut up Delilah.
Those cowboys are right out beef down to Kansas and Cheyenne.
A $1,000 bounty on the American frontier is bound to attract a barrage of ruffians and gunslingers from all directions, especially in a sparsely populated area like Big Whiskey that has lower law enforcement presence. Little Bill knows this well, despite Skinny's optimistic shine to the contrary.
Oh, shit, Bill. Could be nobody won't come at all.
Shortly after, English Bob is introduced as a famous and skilled gunfighter, an eloquent English nationalist employed by the railroads who is provocatively vocal about the supposed superiority of English culture and politics over that of Americans. Instead of offering condolences to his American hosts for the recent assassination attempt on President James Garfield, English Bob takes the opportunity to shamelessly suggest that this would be prime time for the United States to select a king or queen instead of another president.
Close up. Again, I don't wish to give offense when I suggested this country should select a king or even a queen rather than a president.
Writing into Big Whiskey with his biographer, W. W. Beauchamp, the callous Gasconade keeps going as he acknowledges Strawberry Alice's wave and then sadistically exhales pretend shots into two Chinese men walking along the roadside. Although it is clear that English Bob's intent in visiting Big Whiskey, like Money's, is to collect on the bounty by assassinating Quick Mike and Davy, that intent is ironically foreshadowed through the peculiarities of Bob's own boasts, as is Bob's pretense of honor.
It's uncivilized shooting persons of substance.
An Englishman mocking the assassination of an American president justifies his own assassination mission by implicitly regarding his would-be victims as people without substance, much like the Chinese men he pretend shot with perverse relish. This again hints at a running theme throughout the film, one that Money and his crew bring to full light: the use of one injustice as an excuse or rationalization for a much more egregious and destructive one. English Bob serves as a prime exemplar of what Little Bill calls men of low character, men whose base constitution is grounded in unprincipled, self-aggrandizing foulness, a charlatan who cloaks himself and his lethal resolve in fanciful tall tales of bravery and justice. Upon entering Big Whiskey, he plainly ignores the posted sign prohibiting guns within the city limits, only to then brazenly lie to Little Bill's deputy when asked point blank about carrying a firearm, with his pistol clearly visible. This prompts the deputy to organize the rest of the Big Whiskey police force to disarm the non-compliant visitors, allowing the audience a rare glimpse into the minds of the law enforcement officers and their sentiments on Little Bill.
Seemed like you were scared.
Little Bill? Him scared?
I've never seen him up against any like these ones. Killers.
Little Bill come out of Kansas and Texas, boys. He worked them tough towns.
Just wondered. Anybody could be scared.
Well, he wasn't scared, boys.
This scene is fairly unique in the sense that it provides a sharp humanizing aspect to the antagonists, an aspect that is quickly subsumed within the contrasting assurance of "he wasn't scared," referring to Little Bill, as well as Bill's reactive authoritarianism that follows in close succession. There is little question for the Big Whiskey constables of English Bob's murderous intent, and they are appropriately taking no chances in confronting him. This is somewhat reminiscent of the Earps and Doc Holliday attempting to disarm several cowboys prior to the renowned OK Corral gunfight, featured famously in films like Tombstone and Wyatt Earp. Unlike in those films, however, the storyline in Unforgiven presents the authorities as the antagonists, making one wonder how different the audience's sympathies would have been in a film like Tombstone if instead the central perspective was that of the outlaw cowboys. In the meantime, English Bob continues flippantly dismissing the assassination attempt on President Garfield at the barber shop, leaving the proprietor in stunned dismay over his rhetoric.
That the sight of royalty would cause you to dismiss all thoughts of bloodshed, and you would stand, how shall I put it, in awe. Now, a president. Well, I mean, why not shoot the president?
Imagine for a moment the absolute impudence and contempt at work here, an Englishman mocking the assassination of the American head of state and preaching English political supremacy on American Independence Day, no less. After exiting the barber shop, he is confronted by Little Bill and the rest of the Big Whiskey police force. He again lies about how many firearms he's carrying on his person.
I'll have that 32, Bob.
It is important to recognize that both in modern terms and under the laws of numerous states in 1880, English Bob has technically already committed the crime of attempted murder, which is generally defined as taking any substantial step or any act towards the commission of a murder, though ultimately failing, being prevented, or being intercepted prior to completing the crime. Wyoming appears to have enacted its own attempt statute in 1884, a few years after Unforgiven's events, though Little Bill would most likely have been well familiar with the crime from his days working in Kansas, one of the states that had the statute. Traveling to the city or town where the intended victim resides, especially when doing so armed, goes well beyond mere preparation. It would certainly qualify as any substantial step or any act, though it would be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to prove in court, even if Wyoming had the law in effect at that time. Little Bill knows this. He knows exactly why English Bob has come to Big Whiskey, and he knows that beating English Bob will send a resounding message to all other would-be assassins who are likely on their way to collect the bounty. As referenced earlier, this is the Old West American frontier, 1880, and Big Whiskey is in the vicinity of other frontier cities and territories that are known for their tumultuous and violent disturbances. Those are the villains that Little Bill hopes will get the hint when they hear that the famous gunfighter English Bob has been roughed up and sent packing.
All those villains! Down in Cheyenne!
Although there is no question that the beating he delivers upon Bob is technically unlawful, especially since there has been no trial or formal charge, it is neither draconian nor without basis, given the circumstances, and it would not have been of great surprise to the frontier populace at the time. For willfully disobeying the ordinance against carrying firearms and entering the town with the intent to commit murder, English Bob suffered a thrashing and a night in jail. The alternatives would have been to simply disarm Bob and/or temporarily hold him for court, both of which would sharply risk the gunman reacquiring firearms to fulfill his mission, which is why Little Bill adds this final warning.
I guess you know, Bob, that if I see you again, I'm just going to start shooting and figure it's self-defense. Ha!
Considering Big Whiskey's isolation and Bob's intentions and actions, his beating is not remotely without merit, and it would be difficult to maintain that he did not deserve precisely the unpleasantness that befell him. Little Bill takes the opportunity during Bob's overnight imprisonment to express his utter scorn for the type of person Bob is. He deconstructs the tall tales of bravery and honor that Bob has fed his biographer, W.W. Beauchamp, revealing his so-called heroics to be nothing more than cold-blooded murder.
Wait a minute, you mean that English Bob killed him when he didn't even have...
He gives Beauchamp a fast lesson about how maintaining a cool head and not getting rattled under fire are far more important than being a quick shot, a discipline that he, in yet another piece of ironic foreshadowing, eventually fails to exercise.
Look, son, being a good shot and being quick with a pistol, that don't do no harm, but it don't mean much next to being cool-headed. A man who will keep his head, not get rattled under fire. Like as not, he'll kill you.
But if the other fella is quicker and fires first...
Then he'll be hurrying and he'll miss.
But if he doesn't miss?
Then he'll kill you. Yeah, that's why there's so few dangerous men around like old Bob and like me.
Little Bill's recognition that he shares certain elements with his adversaries is further alluded to when both he and Money presume Beauchamp to be a writer of letters as opposed to books, although this would not have been unusual in 1880, given the conspicuously higher illiteracy rate and lower prevalence of books. The common view often uses these secondary parallels in place of analyzing the character's behavior and motives, rapidly jumping to the fallacious implication that both antagonist and protagonist are fundamentally alike on account of their shared grit and unfamiliarity with literature. By such standard, the character of Rooster Cogburn from the 1969 Western classic True Grit would easily fall in the same category, as would probably the majority of protagonists from Western classics in general. Little Bill resolutely believes he is using his abilities for the higher good, maintaining peace and order in an isolated Western town, punishing and exposing pompous frauds like English Bob, who would gravely threaten that order. Despite these lofty sentiments, however, it is clear that Little Bill has an ego, and he relishes the occasion to humiliate and emasculate his old rival, especially in front of someone who has bought into Bob's fabrications. After daring Beauchamp to shoot him to demonstrate his point about dangerous men and the nerve required to fire at someone, he cannot resist taking on Beauchamp's own dare to give the revolver to English Bob, only to hover a hand over his pistol, ready to strike Bob down if he should foolishly accept the offer.
Hot, ain't it? You didn't even put your finger on the trigger.
What if I gave it to him?
Give it to him. You're right not to take it, Bob. I would have killed you.
It should be noted that this sequence is not designed or planned by Little Bill. He did not expect Beauchamp's dare, and accepts it to not lose face, as well as for the opportunity to further spite his adversary. Given the smugness and outrageous callousness of Bob's character, on top of his criminal history and murderous motivation, Little Bill's animus against him here is neither surprising nor unwarranted. Even after being released and sent on his way, Bob continues his lordly rant of English supremacy, deriding his American hosts, including the very prostitutes on whose behalf he came to Big Whiskey in the first place, as savages without morals or laws.
You're a lot of savages, that's what you all are! A bunch of bloody savages!
This sanctimonious pretense is coming from the same person who murdered Two Gun Corcoran, took sadistic pleasure in pretend shooting two random Chinese men, mocked the assassination of the American head of state, and was well on his way to consummate his own assassination mission before being decisively stopped. English Bob's part in the film serves to elucidate the complexity and distinctiveness of Little Bill's character, particularly through calculated contrast to money. On one hand is the antagonist law enforcement officer, who is presented in the naturally caustic role of authoritarian enforcer, while on the other is the penitent protagonist, who continues to be depicted in highly affable circumstances. Peppered in between English Bob's time at Big Whiskey are scenes of Money and Ned calmly riding through the open frontier, discussing the domestic peculiarities of their lives. Money opines on his moral repugnance against paying for sexual companionship, his dedication to upholding the memory of his deceased wife, and his fatherly responsibilities to his children. After the Schofield kid mistakenly shoots at them, Money's brotherly fidelity to his partner Ned is revealed when he refuses to go on unless the kid accepts a three-way split of the bounty. In between the Big Whiskey jail scene, the three are shown preparing for sleep around a campfire while the kid questions Money about one of his infamous brushes with the law, praising Money's daring escape and murder of two police deputies. Revealing the protagonist's diabolical and unsavory history through the lens of impressionable youth further softens the exposure of these acutely troubling facts, along with serving to place Money and Ned in a somewhat paternal role relative to their younger companion. The upshot of this intermeshed scenery is the audience's natural expectation that Little Bill is using or will use the law for some evil or otherwise corrupt purpose, contrary to the actual motivational impetus that we see in the film. The critical distinction remains between that of legality and morality. Although Little Bill's extrajudicial punishments are illegal and technically abuses of power, their ethical constitution is a far more intricate matter. To better illustrate this, it is useful to consider the popular moral alignment system that ranges from lawful to chaotic. The common perspective classes Little Bill as a lawful evil, a character who uses the law to effect his malevolent and unjust will against those who oppose him. The indispensable element of this orientation is behavior on the basis of innate wickedness or otherwise unethical zealotry, often exercising the letter of the law at the expense of the spirit of the law, and enjoying the resulting iniquity. If we compare this to Little Bill's actions in the film, we see mostly the exact opposite. He chiefly follows the spirit of the law at the expense of the letter of the law. There is no evil, malicious, or unethical motivation to his belligerence. And not only is there no evidence that he takes unjustified opportunity in delivering corporal penalties, but he abstains from doing so when there does not appear to be a practical benefit to maintaining law and order, even when such penalties are deserved.
See a man carrying 2 pistols and a Henry rifle and crying like a damn baby.
So, you killed him?
No, but I should have.
Have you seen enough blood for one night? Huh?
If the focus is shifted solely upon Little Bill's malfeasance at the start of the film, the label of lawful evil still does not readily fit, as his motivation there arises from the provincialism and expediency of the frontier, not a design to harm or delight in any resulting iniquity. His slight smile after finding the 2 cowboys denotes a satisfaction with his perceived finesse of the resolution, and though that resolution remains unjust, it is not advanced by any malevolence or revel in Delilah's plight. The dispensation of the letter of the law in favor of a hyper-pragmatic frontier authoritarianism does not itself, of course, elevate Little Bill in the moral graces. Rather, it is the fact that, with the exception of the disproportionate punishments of the 2 cowboys at the beginning of the film, his treatments of English Bob and, as we will discuss shortly, Money and Ned are all largely commensurate to the crime and circumstances. This goes centrally against not only the audience's perfunctory assumptions of Little Bill's moral alignment, but against Little Bill's very role as sheriff, an antagonist in the position of law enforcement who is expected to be of the lawful evil variety, instead behaves somewhat closer to the exact inverse, that is, chaotic good, albeit steeped in near constant abrasiveness and militancy. If we further contextualize this in the prevailing ethics and practices of the American frontier, Little Bill starts to approach the trope of good is not nice, a character who, despite possessing strong measures of genuine moral integrity, is simply less likable by the audience, mainly on account of being represented in a highly unsympathetic light or situation, or for having an off-putting ego or personality. This is especially true in Unforgiven, where almost every presence of the protagonist, up until the film's climactic final confrontation, is brimming with agreeable relatability, relentlessly and strategically juxtaposed to the bellicose enforcements of the antagonist. The ensuing contrast effectively buries a more comprehensive and sober analysis under the comfortable and romanticized perspective of evil, corrupt sheriff versus reformed dark hero. Why does Little Bill beat Money and why does he whip Ned? Like their predecessor English Bob, Money and Ned enter Big Whiskey armed and with the intent to commit murder. Money repeatedly lies when questioned about having a firearm.
But I ain't armed. But the fact is I ain't carrying no firearm.
This provokes Little Bill into action. He knows, and is unequivocally correct, that the most likely reason a stranger like Money is in town at that time is to collect on the bounty. His deception and refusal to surrender his weapon greatly bolster the probability of malintent. Like his predecessor, Money's acts up to this point are already in violation of not only the town's ordinance against carrying firearms, but are also sufficient for the general definition of attempted murder. By traveling to the place of their intended victims, they have already taken a substantial and direct step towards committing that murder. Again, proving this in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt would be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, and temporarily locking Money up for the concealed firearm would not only fail to send an appropriately forceful warning to the would-be assassins and outlaws who are likely still making their way towards Big Whiskey, but would risk Money reacquiring firearms in pursuit of his fatal goal, just like English Bob. Accordingly, Little Bill again elects the extrajudicial option of a public beating. His words during the beating are of special significance.
You see, Mr. Beauchamp, This is the kind of trash I can get out. You find this kind in all the saloons in all your prosperous communities. Wichita? Over in Cheyenne? Abilene? But you won't find them in the town of Big Whiskey.
You won't find them in the town of Big Whiskey. As before, the mention of Wichita, Cheyenne, and Abilene is reference to hotbeds of disorder during the Old West. That is the context at work here, a secluded provincial hamlet that is, in essence, being besieged by mercenarial forces who will cut through any law to achieve their murderous objective. Following the letter of the law against such a criminal element in this setting is not only practically and logistically imprudent, but a lean response against concerted villainy risks emboldening and provoking it to an even higher degree, further endangering everyone in the township. The notion that Little Bill incited the situation by failing to properly punish Quick Mike at the start of the film does not validate the events that follow. In no way are the prostitutes justified in putting out a bounty on the lives of the two cowboys. Again, Davy is innocent, and Quick Mike, despite deserving far more than just a 5-horse fine, has not earned a death sentence. Cutting someone across the face several times in a fit of rage, though atrocious and barbaric, does not rise to a degree of heinousness where death is the appropriate penalty, particularly where the resulting harm is not incapacitating. Ned and the kid even seem to realize this on some level when they experience differing forms of remorse after the killings, especially the kid, despite his attempt to reassure himself that they had it coming. The prostitutes could have put out a bounty for Quick Mike's comparable maiming or even his severe beating. They could have hired an attorney to bring the matter before the county or territorial government, something they would have had ample money to do. Instead, they used one injustice as an excuse and rationalization of a much more devastating one, something that is further compounded by the fact that Strawberry Alice was present and observed Davy doing his best to protect Delilah after Quick Mike started cutting her, yet she still vindictively and ruthlessly decided to put a price on his life, along with his partner. Not only does the common perspective ignore or dismiss these conditions outright, but it again falls hapless victim to the plot's unremitting juxtaposition of contrite protagonist to uncompromising antagonist. Just prior to his first confrontation with Little Bill, Money begins to display symptoms of ill health, confiding in Ned about a nightmarish vision he's had of a former member of his outlaw gang.
Jesus, Will. You look like shit.
You remember Eagle and Shot?
Yeah.
I saw him.
Well, he's dead.
No, I saw him, Ned. His head was all broke open. Could see inside of it.
Jesus, man. They got a fever. Take a drink, will you?
Worms were coming out.
Immediately after the beating, Money's health deteriorates into a severe and life-threatening sickness as Ned and the kid tend to his wounds. Ned demonstrates his reciprocal brotherly fidelity to his partner when the kid beckons him to assassinate the two cowboys on their own. During his illness, Money deliriously and frantically confesses terrifying visions of the Angel of Death and the decaying face of his deceased wife, fears his imminent mortality, and pleads with Ned never to reveal his vicious history to his children.
I seen the Angel of Death. I seen her river, Ned. He's got snake eyes.
Oh, well. Who's got snake eyes?
It's the Angel of Death. I'm scared of dying.
Easy, partner. Easy.
I see Claudia, too.
Well, that's good, Will. That's good you saw Claudia, ain't it?
Her face was all covered with worms. Oh, Dad, I'm scared. I'm dying. You won't... No, don't tell nobody. Don't tell my kids. None of the things I done, you hear me?
All right, Bill.
When he finally overcomes the worst of his affliction, his conversation with Delilah, the cut prostitute, is humble, reflective, and kindly, as may be expected of someone who just narrowly escaped the clutches of a dire and agonizing infirmity. He compassionately sets Delilah's mind at ease about her facial scars, explaining that it is devotion and commitment to his wife that is preventing him from accepting her offer of free sexual companionship. As referenced earlier, juxtaposing these heartrending scenes of illusory victimization to the acute authoritarianism of Little Bill invites the audience into an insidious moral seduction, extreme commiseration for the protagonist, and extreme antipathy for the antagonist effectively obscure and bury objective analysis of what is happening. Money's amiability and penitence for the past has nothing to do with the ethical justification of his actions in the present. He remains a mercenary assassin who ultimately succeeds in murdering the two cowboys, one of whom is innocent and the other not deserving of death. Again, even after seeing Delilah and realizing that the stories of her injuries have been fantastically embellished, there is no pause or reconsideration. There is no care what the culpability level of the two cowboys is, or whether killing them is justified in the first place. For Money and his crew, it is just about money.
We done stuff for money before, Ned.
Similarly, the fact that Little Bill has an ego, or that he exercises frontier justice at the expense of the letter of the law, is distinct from the circumstantial and contextual elements that comprise the bulk of his actions' morality. Following Money's thrashing, debilitating illness, and recovery, the audience is all but perfectly primed to accept the crew's two assassinations as righteous vengeance, a sentiment that is only fortified by the events that follow. But what about Ned? Unlike Money and English Bob, he receives far more than just a run-of-the-mill beating. Little Bill methodically whips him to death after he is caught by the Bartee cowboys. Surely that is sufficient to class Bill as the cold-blooded, despotic sadist that the common view says he is, right? Three principal facts surrounding Ned's death heavily discredit this conclusion. Primarily, at the time of his apprehension, Ned is no longer guilty of just attempted murder. He has consummated the act, playing a key role in the assassination of the first cowboy. The fact that it is Money who fires the final shot into Davy is irrelevant. All three, including Ned and the kid, participated in and are now guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, one of the few crimes in 1800s United States jurisprudence that carried a near-universal penalty of death. Even today, a majority of states, as well as the US federal government, retain the death penalty as a punishment for premeditated murder. Whether Ned or the kid is charged as an accessory or principal to first-degree murder makes no difference. They would be deemed and considered as principals in either case, and subject to the exact same penalty, that is, death by hanging. The modern-day law on this question is nearly identical. One may further argue that Ned's shot was tantamount to Money's in weight because it incapacitated Davy and rendered him an easy target, though this is unnecessary and does not change the legal calculus that already determines Ned's guilt. Ned may also be charged as an accessory to the murder of the second cowboy, Quick Mike. Despite not participating directly in the second killing, he was part of the conspiratorial planning and effort that encompassed the slaying of both cowboys, thereby exposing him to criminal liability for both assassinations. The defense of abandonment or renunciation does not appear to have existed in 1880 Wyoming, though even if it did, it would likely have required the conspirator who abandons a conspiracy to successfully prevent the remaining members from obtaining their criminal objective, similarly to the modern Wyoming statute. Ned does no such thing, and he even offers his Spencer rifle to Money to aid in their plot against the second cowboy. In either case, however, Ned is unmistakably culpable for the killing of the first cowboy, Davy, and his death is all but a legal inevitability in 1880. He would almost certainly have been tried, convicted, and executed for first-degree premeditated murder. Money's contention of Ned didn't kill anyone towards the end of the film is not only categorically false, but serves as the finishing polish to the common perspective's subtle persuasion. The audience's tenderness for Ned is all but already cemented through the twin elements of Ned's departure from the assassination mission after the first killing, and the depiction of his grievous whipping at the hands of Little Bill. Money's exculpatory statement quietly conceals both the fact that Ned is guilty of murder and the reason why Little Bill whips him in the first place, something I will discuss momentarily. This allows the unwary viewer to not only comfortably accept Money as an avenging angel of death, but openly applaud his ferocious destruction of Little Bill. Secondly is the reason why Little Bill starts whipping Ned. Contrary to the common perspective's assumption or implication, it is not because Little Bill wants to torture Ned or enjoys torturing Ned, and it is not even to punish Ned for his role in the murders. Rather, it is to acquire critical information to capture and prevent Ned's accomplices from committing any further homicides.
No, that's not what you said.
Hell if it ain't.
No, you said, Elroy Quincy out of Medicine Hat and Henry Tate out of Cheyenne.
Hell if I did.
Money's crew has already successfully assassinated one of the cowboys, and Little Bill has every reason to believe that they are intent on killing the second one, along with anyone who gets in their way. The information that Ned can provide is vital for the discovery and arrest of his co-conspirators, preventing them from murdering anyone else. That is why Little Bill whips Ned. There is a clear and imperative public menace that can likely be averted or neutralized if Ned reveals the identities, plans, and likenesses of his confederates. And it is only because Ned repeatedly lies about his partners and refuses to surrender that information that Little Bill continues to whip him.
Now, Ned, them whores are going to tell different lies than you. And when their lies ain't the same as your lies, well, I ain't gonna hurt no woman. But I'm gonna hurt you. Not gentle like before, but bad.
In the middle of the interrogation, Little Bill is informed that Ned's friends have succeeded in killing the second cowboy, Quick Mike, confirming the exigency of the situation and giving Little Bill even more reason to magnify his interrogation methods. There have now been 2 murders in the surrounding area, and if Ned refuses to cooperate, a third or fourth could easily follow. Not to mention that his accomplices would likely evade capture since the Big Whiskey police officers do not know who they are. It is the communication of the second murder itself to Little Bill that prompts him to intensify his beating of Ned, leading to Ned's confession of the identities of his collaborators. Up until that point, he had doggedly refused to disclose their true names. We learn all of this from the prostitute Little Sue when she delivers the $1,000 bounty to Money and the kid.
These questions Little Bill was asking, what kind were they?
About where you and him was.
Then what?
A cowboy come in saying he killed Quick Mike in the shit house at the Bar T.
So Little Bill killed him for what we done.
Not on purpose. But he started hurting him worse, making him tell stuff. First Ned wouldn't say nothing. And then Little Bill hurt him so bad, he said who you was. He said how you was really William Money out of Missouri. And Little Bill said the same William Money that dynamited the Rock Island and Pacific in '69, killing women and children and all. And Ned said he done a lot worse than that. Said he was more cold-blooded than William Bonney, and how if he hurt Ned again, he was gonna come kill him. Like he killed the U.S. Marshal in '70.
That didn't scare Little Bill, did it?
No, sir.
These conditions do not altogether ratify Bill's treatment of Ned, but they are nevertheless a far cry from the common perspective's unsubstantiated explanation of sadism or psychopathy as Little Bill's motivations for the beating. Finally, following from the previous point, and perhaps of utmost importance, is the fact that Little Bill did not intend to kill Ned. His motivation, once again, is purely investigative. The common perspective usually glosses right over this, running with Money's false assertion that Little Bill deliberately killed Ned out of some sort of sadistic or vindictive retaliation, which feeds into Money's words to Little Bill shortly thereafter. Of course, this is not to remotely imply that simply because Little Bill's motive is investigatory or that the circumstances are dire, that he somehow has carte blanche to dole out physical abuse as he pleases. Rather, the question of intent and the exigency of the situation are cardinal factors in determining the appropriate legal and ethical blameworthiness of Little Bill's actions relative to Ned. To equitably evaluate that blameworthiness, we must first consider the matter of luck, which unfortunately plays a compelling and unavoidable part in the law. A simple analogy to a bar fight illustrates this concept well. If one bar patron punches another in the face, the legal blameworthiness of that action depends heavily on the result of the punch, while the ethical blameworthiness remains the same regardless of the result. In scenario 1, bar patron A punches bar patron B in the face for no good reason, with no intent to kill. Bar patron B suffers a small bruise on his temple, but is otherwise unharmed. In scenario 2, the exact same thing happens under the exact same circumstances, except bar patron B, unbeknownst to bar patron A, has an underlying cerebral condition that regrettably brings about his death following the punch to the face. In scenario 1, bar patron A is guilty of simple battery, but in scenario 2, for the exact same action and state of mind, he is guilty of at least manslaughter and potentially second-degree murder. The only difference in the legal consequences between the two scenarios is the result of the punch. In scenario 1, that result was a simple bruise, but in scenario 2, the exact same act precipitated death. Ethically speaking, bar patron A's actions are morally identical in both scenarios. It is the same action under the same known circumstances, with the same state of mind. Luck is the only operative difference that brings about the divergent legal outcomes of the punch, a principle known as the eggshell skull rule in law. The frailty of a victim generally does not serve to limit liability for the harm they suffer due to the negligence or intentional act of another. Relating this back to Little Bill's whipping and beating of Ned, the same principle applies. Even though it is made clear that Little Bill did not intend to kill Ned, he is nevertheless legally responsible for his death. If Ned had survived the whipping and beating, Little Bill would have been guilty in modern times of at least aggravated assault and battery, given that he does not have the legal authority to dole out corporal punishment in the absence of a court order. Because Ned did not survive the beating, Little Bill is guilty of at least involuntary manslaughter, sometimes termed criminally negligent homicide, and possibly, depending on the full extent of the beating, second-degree murder, which often includes death resulting from acts that show an extreme indifference to human life. Although the audience is not shown Ned's beating beyond the whipping, Little Sue's words provide a material clue to its nature.
First, Ned wouldn't say nothing. And then Little Bill hurt him so bad, he said who he was. Not on purpose. But he started hurting him worse, making him tell stuff. He was making him answer questions and beating him up, and then Ned just died.
Little Sue's specific mention of Little Bill not intending to kill Ned, along with the element of suddenness in her statement, "Ned just died," suggests that the beating inflicted upon Ned was calculated to force him to divulge information and not to fatally wound him, which, if true, would make manslaughter the more likely legal charge. In either case, however, the 1880 Wyoming statute on second-degree murder required the killing to be purposeful and malicious, something the film makes clear was not part of Little Bill's motivation in beating Ned. The punishment for manslaughter per the 1880 statute ranged from 1 to 10 years incarceration, though it is highly probable that a jury and judge would strongly consider Little Bill's motivation of protecting the community, the emergency situation, and the fact that Ned would almost surely have been executed for his role in the assassination plot as mitigating factors in deciding Little Bill's ultimate punishment. The greater prevalence and tolerance of corporal punishment on the American frontier would also have been an influential factor. Despite the gravity of these potential legal consequences, the ethical blameworthiness of Little Bill's actions here remains the same regardless of Ned's death, which is why I stated earlier that Little Bill's disproportional punishment of Quick Mike and Davy at the beginning of the film is his worst act. Given that Ned is guilty of murder and that he holds information that is crucial to bringing his Confederates to justice, along with preventing any further murders and loss of life in the community, Little Bill has far more justification and reason to whip and beat Ned than he does Quick Mike or Davy at the beginning of the film. Ned's death changes the legal calculus of Little Bill's actions, but not the ethical calculus. If we compare these circumstances to, for example, the punching, slamming, and brutal pummeling of the Joker during the interrogation scene in The Dark Knight, the significance of perspective becomes even more evident. Hammering the Joker with molded fists and savagely smashing his head into glass may just as easily be classed as a form of torture by our progressive rationality, especially since this scene, unlike Unforgiven, takes place under modern sensibilities. Is the abuse dispensed by the Caped Crusader justified on account of the Joker being a homicidal psychopath who cackles at the beating? Is it justified when considering that the Joker holds information that has a definite probability of saving lives, just as Ned holds information that has a definite probability of saving lives? What if the Joker had died or been permanently maimed due to his assailant accidentally slamming him too hard or rupturing a critical artery with his merciless punches? These questions are naturally subdued or entirely absent from most viewings of The Dark Knight because the audience's sympathies are carefully arranged and guided by their presuppositions and the perspective through which the plot is presented, easing what would normally give rise to serious moral discomfort. The Joker is an archetypal example of chaotic evil, and torturously clobbering him for information that will prevent the loss of life is taken in stride, especially since the clobbering is delivered by someone who is supposed to represent a force of good, someone with whom the audience is made to identify. Despite the obvious differences in plot and characters between these two films, similar mechanics are in operation in Unforgiven, but with the roles reversed. By the time Ned is thrashed by Little Bill, the common perspective's appeal has fully developed. The preceding hour and 40 minutes of unyielding juxtaposition between sympathetic protagonist and unsympathetic antagonist has done its job fantastically and easily overwhelms a dispassionate analysis. Immediately preceding Ned's capture and whipping are scenes showing him parting ways with Money and the kid, allowing the audience more room to dissociate Ned from his direct participation in the murder of the first cowboy, and consolidate the gratifying notion of Big Bad Sheriff torturing an innocent man to death. And although the film's narrative is notably, even commendably, unimpeded by racial animus between the central characters, the whipping of an African American by a Caucasian unequivocally conjures up sordid instances of American history and stereotypical victimization accounts, further reinforcing offhand acceptance of the common outlook. The climactic denouement is now ready and set for the penitent former outlaw to deliver his ruinous vengeance. At this point, even the complete revelation of Money's horrific past atrocities and depravity barely fazed the viewer who has wholeheartedly and enthusiastically capitulated to the moral allure of this narrative. For such a view, satisfaction of the film's unwavering buildup is vociferously demanded, and it can only be satiated through the cathartic massacre of Little Bill and his deputies.
Well, sir, you are a cowardly son of a bitch. You just shot an unarmed man.
Well, he should have harmed himself. He's gonna decorate his saloon with my friend.
You beat William Money out of Missouri. killed women and children.
That's right. I've killed women and children. Killed just about everything that walks or crawled at one time or another. And I'm here to kill you, Little Bill. For what you did to Ned.
Under this more comprehensive examination and contextualization, are Little Bill's actions and persona justified? Does he emerge a redeemed and virtuous character in the midst of intractable villainy? No. He remains critically flawed and shrouded in moral provincialism, ready to forego due process for the sake of expediency and authoritarian imposition. Does this, however, substantiate the common perspective on Little Bill? Does it substantiate the general position that he is some psychopathic killer, some sadistic backwater brute whose extrajudicial punishments are decidedly wicked and self-serving? No, it does not. An objective consideration of the plot dispels such judgment as the product of an acutely flawed and limited view, an exercise in cursory self-indulgence and intellectual indolence. A multiplicity of this sentiment unfortunately litters the public discourse, seemingly the result of a harmonic echoing that latched onto the first convenient idea and propagated it ad infinitum. This lengthy thesis, submitted as part of a master's program at the University of Washington, glowingly characterizes money as a hero who saves the community through heroic actions, while reviling Little Bill as corrupt and sadistic. Shmoop.com, though attesting to the film's ambivalence on good and bad, carries similar myopic figments, labeling Little Bill as the equally evil sheriff and a psychopath control freak, with barely an iota of reasoned support for these scathing and bombastic musings, falsely describing the second cowboy Davy as an accomplice and championing money as a deliverer of justice. Villains.fandom designates Little Bill as an evildoer whose hobbies include torturing and killing those he dislikes, and a sexist who celebrates the death of Ned, warping Ned's display in front of Greeley's from a warning to prospective murderers into a celebration of his demise. FlavorWire.com's Rich Contradictions article brands Money's violence as necessary, something he must do. A reformed family man who avenges the murder of his friend against a man of grinning evil and casual sadism, offering Little Bill's cheeky smirk over ridding his town from a fractious ruffian as evidence of sadistic motivation. Despite fully recognizing the moral ambiguity and subversion of Western tropes in Unforgiven, these and scores of other sources seem compelled to overlay their predispositions and their proclivity for traditional hero-villain dynamics, undercutting parts of the stark realism they have already acknowledged. Even works that are refreshingly objective in their analyses of the film's dualistic inversions, such as William Beard's Unforgiven and the Uncertainties of the Heroic, or K. Austin Collins' Unforgiven closed the book on movie westerns, partially succumb to this indulgence, saturating the plot's coarse realisms in competing motifs of mythos deconstruction. Janet Thumim's essay, Masculinity and Incompetence in Unforgiven, and J.W. Rinsler's article, Unforgiven, A Fistful of Evil Dollars, are two of the worst offenders, hijacking the film in service of their respective agendas, gender theory for Thumim and Marxism for Rinsler. Hammering a strained framework of competence into her almost dogmatic affirmations, Thumim not only recites the spurious mantras of sadism and misogyny against Little Bill, but derives bizarre preconceived allegories of phallic symbolism, at one point analogizing Little Bill's beating of English Bob to ejaculation. Despite the film's opening scene establishing Davy's shock and effort to defend Delilah, Thummim's vicarious affectations lead her to conveniently insist that it is impossible to distinguish people and actions during the opening, propelling her, perhaps unavoidably, to the fatalistic and detached conclusion that the protagonist's violence and murders are all but utterly justifiable, a proclamation of just deserts that stands in blunt opposition to the film's overarching theme against the notion of deserved. Rinzler, in his article, exalts the protagonist's reprehensible mercenary objectives into an avenging anti-hero who believes he is fighting for a higher good. Rinzler states that Davy holds Delilah while the aggressor slashes her face with a knife, regurgitating the popular and recklessly misleading summary of the film's opening scene. He goes on to propound a contorted Marxist interpretation of Little Bill's sanctions against the two cowboys, transforming the antagonist's crude description of Delilah as property from an exercise in authoritarian expediency into a commentary on the economic exigencies of capitalistic exchange. What Rinzler and many Marxists of his ilk entirely omit is that any economic system, capitalist or otherwise, is distinct from the morality that informs its parameters and direction. That is the idea of the frontier, a place where social mores and law have yet to be fully integrated, not at all a microcosm of the whole country. As with the preceding iterations of the common perspective, so too does Rinzler fall head over heels victim to the film's moral seduction. Money is endorsed as a savior who responds to the prostitute's prayers, and his mercantile motivations, one of the only elements of the film Rinzler ironically chooses to partially exempt from his stock Marxist overlay, are aggrandized into a chivalric mission of defending helpless women. He unabashedly injects sanctimonious reference to the slavery and mass murder of African Americans, cherry-picking Americana in quintessential Marxist fashion and absurdly evaluating it through the lens of modern-day ethics. Again, in a film that is soundly devoid of the cloud of racial animus, Rinzler superimposes it prodigiously. The death of the film's only black man is axiomatic, he writes. Axiomatic, as in, even though race has absolutely nothing to do with the plot, let us pretend that it does anyway because it helps validate a presupposed narrative. These misplaced, ill-conceived inventions are echoed across various YouTube videos as well. Jack's movie reviews, How Unforgiven Ended the Western temporarily, begs the question of whether the uploader even watched the film in full. The review romanticizes money as the remorseful outlaw who values human life, only to then outlandishly equate the heinous depravity of money's early years to the freewheeling maverick persona of the man with no name from the Dollars trilogy. Money's mercenary mission is rationalized into a quest for redemption for his past atrocities, born from a sense of being unfulfilled and avenging a prostitute. Reminiscent of Rinzler's gratuitous insertion of slavery and mass murder in his article, Jack's movie reviews offhandedly concocts a phantom rape and appends it to the opening attack on Delilah, despite no such thing ever taking place in the film. To his credit, though he judiciously recognizes the ethical ambiguity presented by the central characters, this reviewer still crashes headfirst into the common trope of commiserating with money and repackaging his assassinations, murders, and brutality as part and parcel of some mythical redemption quest. All plot elements and context that refute or discredit this perspective, including the protagonist's quest being nothing more than an opportunistic money grab, are conveniently ignored. Worse yet is Fandor's video, A Closer Look at Unforgiven, A History of Violence. After opening with a lofty and grandiose framing of archetypal Western imagery, it quickly devolves into the familiar yarn, decrying Little Bill as sadistic and vicious, with barely a shred of plot or character analysis to predicate such frivolous branding. Instead, Fandor, like Jack's movie reviews, shifts to glorifying Unforgiven as if it were among the first westerns to seriously explore what happens to aging gunfighters, a topic that has featured prominently, even conventionally, in films like The Shootist, The Wild Bunch, True Grit, and The Gunfighter from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Contrary to some of these classic entries in the genre, however, Unforgiven's story does not involve a protagonist who is obstructed from quiet retirement, nor one who seeks to restore any sort of balance in exchange for redemption. Money is perfectly free to continue tending to his pig farm. Nobody is pulling him back into anything. His motivation for assassinating the two cowboys is unquestionably money-driven, not unfulfillment, though in either case, the ethics of Money's actions remains the same. The prostitutes are not imprisoned chattel. The film makes clear that they are free to come and go as they please. Little Bill's militant enforcements are sharply tied to an environment that, despite hyperbole in fiction, endured frequent turbulence. Anti-gun ordinances on the frontier were ubiquitous, enacted by nearly every county in Wyoming during the mid to late 1800s. Even if the impression of the early West being wild is completely rejected, that is distinctly not a rejection advanced by Unforgiven. Rather, as mentioned previously, Unforgiven's lore highlights the wild elements of the Old West, replicating the bloodshed of the genre in spectacular fashion. Though Fandor clearly recognizes the tension that exists between this and the film's subversive elements, he earnestly embraces the common stance, brashly and mistakenly promoting Ned as innocent while denouncing Little Bill as wicked. Instead of concluding with the film's ambivalence towards the protagonist's homicides and the absence of moral imperatives, Fandor is inescapably led to the same fatuous declaration that Money's violence is necessary, implying its justification, and that Clint Eastwood and the audience themselves have succumbed to that violence. This is yet another example of the danger I cited earlier of operating from positions of factual irreverence or sympathetic drift, resulting in not only a defense of villainous malignancy, but the wholesale manufacture of specious narratives. Unforgiven may be a revisionist Western, but it is still a Western. It is still a film that is meant to entertain. Its violence, as with other films, stands as a reaffirmation of the values in society against violence. It is incumbent upon the viewer to understand the morality of what is happening, and not to glorify or condone wrongful acts. We enjoy watching these characters in part because their personas and misadventures are so far beyond the ordinary. But would we want to live their life? Would we want someone like Money as a friend, an assassin who takes life without hesitation or feeling, or perhaps someone like the Joker, whom the heavy influence of narrative has even led some to speculate whether his lethal psychopathy is justified? No, and that is what Fandor misses, the distinction between entertainment and normativeness. Though Little Bill's failure to deliver justice to Delilah is firmly a condemnable act, it is born of frontier provincialism, not inherent iniquity. As much as it opens the door to the homicidal deprivation of Money and his crew, so too does it tempt sympathy with that deprivation, masked in a pretense of redemption and chivalry. Ironically, it is the collapse of Unforgiven's search for meaning and moral vindication that ultimately imparts the greatest meaning to the film. The illusions and comforts that cloak Money throughout his course are brutally shattered in the climactic showdown, suggesting two prominent options for the audience: the bleak vacuum of not knowing who to sympathize with, or submitting to the moral reserves and affability that have been built up in favor of Money and against Little Bill during the preceding hour and 50 minutes. This, however, is not a dilemma or a dichotomy, nor is it an intent to deceive on the part of the filmmaker. A methodical analysis of the characters, theme, and context exposes the common perspective's tenuous grounding, and opens the third alternative. Redemptive violence, as presented in the film, is nothing but an illusion that hides opportunistic degradation, a morally bankrupt facade that invites with sympathetic appeal, only to deliver a reality of unmitigated and predatory bloodshed. That is the core idea behind the momentous line, "Deserves got nothing to do with it." As much as we would like consequential events and actions to pacify our angst and elevate us through existential insight, we are instead left with the desolation of being a mere victim of circumstance. That is the symbolism of the American flag waving in the background during Money's departure from Big Whiskey, as well as Little Bill building his crooked house. Money is a representation of the open and vicious lawlessness of the American frontier, the ferocity and destructiveness of chaotic self-gratification. And the crooked house is a symbol of Little Bill's failure to keep his town safe from that destructiveness.
I don't deserve this. To die like this. I was building a house. Deserves got nothing to do with it. I'll see you in hell, William Money.
In the literal sense of his dying words, though he is certainly not what we would imagine a paragon of virtue to be, Little Bill did not deserve to die. Unfortunately for him, deserves got nothing to do with it.